Welcome to BibleDudes. This lecture is going to be about Amos, who's one of my favorite prophets in the Hebrew Bible. His strong message about social justice resonates with my experiences. He's the first prophet to introduce a theme that we'll see repeatedly in the later texts, the great and terrible day of Yahweh, or more commonly in English, the day of the Lord. Amos is very upset with the way that people are behaving, especially the behavior of people in Israel. His name, which in Hebrew is Amos, means to carry. It's most likely a shortened form of a longer name that had a theophoric element such as Yahweh or El, the name for God, something like Amos El or Amos Yah. So the idea is the name means God or Yahweh carries, not that Amos was a strong man who could carry a lot or something like that. Let's see where we're at in the Hebrew Bible with Amos. Remember, many Jewish people refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Tanakh. It's an acronym with the T, the N, and the K standing for the Hebrew words Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. Nevi'im is the Hebrew word for prophets, and Ketuvim is the Hebrew word for writings. So altogether, the T, the N, and the K, we get Tanakh, another name for the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And you could guess with Amos, we're right in the middle of the Nevi'im or prophets section. The Nevi'im is further divided into former prophets. These are the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the latter prophets. So with Amos, we're in the latter prophets, and latter prophets are further divided into major and minor. He's not one of the 3 major prophets, which are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, but he's one of the 12 minor prophets that we see here. These are also called the Book of the 12. And we see Amos there. All right, to learn about Amos as the messenger, let's look at one of his most famous statements. He identifies himself as follows: I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet, but I am a herdsman and a tender of sycamore fig trees. Amos was not a wealthy man. He identifies himself as a herdsman, meaning he watched over sheep and goats, but also as a tender of sycamore fig trees. It turns out the small figs on the sycamore tree need to be pricked so they can have a tiny hole into which a small wasp called Ceratolin arabicus could crawl inside and fertilize the fig. So Amos would bring his flock to an area, and while the sheep and goats were grazing, he would spend some time stabbing these figs. Amos is from the city of Tekoa in the country of Judah. It's about 10 kilometers from Jerusalem. Incidentally, this is the city that supplied the, quote, wise woman of Tekoa, end quote, who Joab used to mediate peace between King David and his son Absalom, and that story is in Samuel 14. So Amos lives in Judah, but the interesting thing is that he travels north to the country of Israel to deliver his prophetic message. This is very unusual, as prophets tend to prophesy in their homelands and not abroad. Amos is the only prophet in the Nevi'im section of the Bible who lives in one nation, but physically prophesies in another. Yes, Jonah does that too, but most Bible scholars see that as a non-historical story, whereas Bible scholars believe that Amos's trip to Israel was a historical event. Also, it must be noted that it isn't just anywhere in Israel that he goes to, but he travels to Bethel, a cult center with a long religious history. Let's look at a map. All right, here we see the Dead Sea, Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea. So if we add some features, it's going to look like this. The border between Israel to the north and Judah to the south is about here. Notice Tekoa, the hometown of Amos. Then Jerusalem, the capital city, is just to the north, the capital city of Judah. But Amos is heading to Israel in order to deliver his prophecy. Bethel plays a prominent role in Genesis with the patriarchs. It's originally called Luz, but gets the name changed to Bethel, which literally means house of God. Beit means house, El means God. Yahweh tells Jacob to go to Bethel and build an altar, and that's where Jacob receives his name Israel in Genesis 34. All right, let's take a look at the superscription or heading, and it starts off, the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds from Tekoa, concerning a vision about Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Note with other prophets they'll describe the vision of the prophet, but here the author writes the words of Amos. He's described as a shepherd here, but later he describes himself as a herdsman. There's not much of a difference. Then the passage talks about a vision he had in the days of Uzziah, who was the king of Judah in the mid-8th century BCE, the same time as Jeroboam II ruled in the north in Israel. Remember, the first Jeroboam was the first king in Israel after the united monarchy became divided. So this is Jeroboam II, and it's about 150 years later after the kingdom became divided, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So Jeroboam II is the grandson of Jehu. He was the usurper who violently ruled the north during the time of Elijah and Elisha. It's important that the author tells us this was 2 years before the earthquake. We have archaeological evidence of this earthquake. I've seen it personally at sites such as Hazor and Zaida, so it's pretty extensive around the whole country. It was a massive one, and it seems to have struck around 760 to 750 BCE. So why does the redactor tell us this? I think the most important part is that Amos prophesies that God is going to wreak destruction on Israel, and then there's an earthquake, and people start believing that Amos has quite a bit of insight into the future, and they should record his prophecies. It's like an early version of the scientific method. People believe that some prophets had the ability to divine through clues what the world had in store. So Amos says God is going to destroy Israel, there's an earthquake, and suddenly people are listening more closely to Amos's words. So, what was life like under the reigns of Uzziah and Jeroboam II? Well, in general, things were pretty good. The urban elite were better off than any time before, and the country of Israel expanded quite a bit to the north. It got back to the size it was under Solomon. One biblical author claims that even Damascus, the capital city of Aram, belonged to Israel at this time, though historians dispute that claim. But the wealthy people in Israel are living large, and they largely believe that their good fortune is due to Yahweh's favor. In short, they believe something like, God likes me, and so I'm able to have all this luxurious stuff. Amos is going to be very upset by this, as we'll soon see. And the prosperity enjoyed by the Israelites in many ways made Amos's job more difficult, because people are less inclined to listen to the warnings of a prophet when the times are good. All right, let's look at some of the themes we have in Amos. First of all, he critiques the political affairs. Social justice plays a big role in Amos. And he also talks about divine election, meaning greater responsibility. And religious infidelity is another theme that we're going to see quite a bit. And scholars divide Amos into 3 sections traditionally. Chapters 1 and 2, we see a formula where he has an indictment of the neighbors of Israel, and then Judah, and finally the indictment of Israel. Chapters 3 through 6 make up the second section, and that lists Israel's sin and God's punishment. And chapters 7 through 9 make out the third and final section. Here we get 5 visions of God's judgment, and then a prophecy of restoration. Amos is not just a narrative story told from beginning to end, like Jonah, for example. Instead, it's an amalgamation of all sorts of literary devices. It's got riddles, a parable, taunts, satire, doxologies, which are a liturgical praise of God, funeral laments, and woe oracles. The book of Amos begins by laying out the sins of the people and then discussing what God is going to do about it. The literary formula is this. It says, "Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of a certain place, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." That's followed by a description of the nation's offense and then a declaration of what the punishment will be. And these are the neighbors that it lists before it gets to Judah and Israel. He starts off with Damascus. It says that they threshed Gilead. Gilead is a mountainous area in the tribe of Manasseh. The punishment for this is fire to the nation of Aram with Damascus being its capital city, and the exile for her people. Then Israel's enemy, the Philistines, is listed. The sin that they apparently did was they sold some Israelites to the Edomites, so that these Israelites became slaves. The punishment will be death and destruction for Philistine cities. The list goes on to include Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and then Judah, and finally Israel. All right, one of my teachers, David Noel Friedman, was very interested in numbers and patterns, and he would talk about this formula that the author used, where they have 7 oracles against neighbors in Judah, and the rhetorical effect is to emphasize the concluding oracle against Israel. Then the 8th oracle has 7 violations of Israel against its covenant. Amos complains that his nation of Judah had rejected the law. In Hebrew, that's Torah. So it's all the laws in the first 5 books of the Bible. And the punishment will be fire to the capital city and the nation. Here we see an image of Jerusalem about 10 years ago. You see the Dome of the Rock right there. It's a beautiful building with a golden colored roof, and it's built in approximately the same place as Solomon's temple would have been built. And so let's see what happens to Israel. Let's read this passage from Amos 2. For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I being Yahweh, will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go to the same maiden, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar upon garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. So basically the rich are selling poor people for luxurious stuff, and then there are some strange sexual practices and too much partying at God's house. Amos goes on to say God historically defeated their enemies, delivered them from Egypt, and, quote, I raised up some of your sons for prophets and some of your young men for Nazirites, end quote. Amos says that punishment for Israel's sin is coming, even for the strong and the fast. Amos says, quote, he who is stout of heart among the mighty shall flee away naked in that day. So that doesn't sound very good. All right, let's talk about the second section of Amos. And the people of Israel believe that God will protect them. All right. This is the idea of divine election, the chosen people. Typically, people believe that if they're the chosen people, God's going to look out for them and no harm will come to them. Amos turns this on its head. He says, yes, you're the chosen people, Israel, but what that means is you have increased responsibility. That God is going to judge you more severely. And there's also some irony going on, more social and economic exploitation, while at the same time there's more religious activity. The wealthy live in luxury at the expense of the disenfranchised poor. And because of this, conquest by foreign enemies and exile are coming. All right, let's look at this. Look at that graphic. All right, the day of Yahweh. Let's look at this passage. Woe, remember we had woe oracles? Here's one. I think it's just the sound people made when they were in a lot of misery. Like, whoa. Not like whoa, like a surfer. All right, but woe to you who long for the day of Yahweh, or Lord, with all caps. Why do you long for the day of Yahweh? That day will be darkness, not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall, only to have a snake bite him. Will not the day of Yahweh be darkness, not light, pitch dark without a ray of brightness? Pay attention to how the prophets all describe the day of Yahweh as a pretty bad day. This guy here, he's running from a lion, meets up with a bear, and then gets bit by a snake. It doesn't sound like it'd be a lot of fun to me. So I tend to avoid people who are anxious to see the day of Yahweh in their lifetime. If there's going to be an apocalypse, I certainly don't want to be around to see it. But in any case, we'll cover the day of Yahweh much more when we get to Zephaniah and Joel, as they more fully develop this idea. But just remember that Amos is credited with inventing this concept. All right. God is a champion of social justice, according to Amos. Let's look at one of these passages here. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fatted cattle I will not look upon. Remove the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Rather, let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos seems upset that the people are having a great time at these religious celebrations, and even though they continue to sacrifice to Yahweh, God is upset with them and will refuse their offerings because of their religious hypocrisy, because of their lack of acts of kindness or acts of justice to the disenfranchised. All right, let's look at another passage from Amos that talks about things that are coming. It says, on the day I punish Israel for his transgressions, I will punish the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altars shall be cut off and fall to the ground. I will smite the winter house with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the many houses shall come to an end, says Yahweh. All right, one of the interesting things about Amos for me is that there are some archaeological finds that bring meaning to some of his passages. First, let's talk about these horned altars. Here is an altar they found at Beersheba. Notice the horns on it. Some people think those might have been used to tie animals to it, but anyway, that's debated. So when he talks about the horns of the altar falling off, here's what that looked like. And these are small pieces of carved out ivory. They found more than 1,000 pieces of polished and carved ivory at Samaria from about this time and a little bit earlier, 9th and 8th century, from the so-called House of Ahab at Samaria. But when he's talking about houses of ivory, people really didn't know what that meant until they found these. And it turns out these small plaques are put on the walls and chairs and furniture to decorate it. Right? So people living in luxury. And then after this passage, Amos goes on to call all the rich women of Samaria the cows of Bashan. Right? It's not nice to talk about people being cows of Bashan, but here is a picture of a cow walking in Bashan. Notice the Sea of Galilee off in the background, and notice that he's walking by a landmine. I don't know what happened to that cow. All right, now we'll move on to the final of the three sections, the final section where Amos describes 5 different visions. This first vision is locusts, right? These are like giant grasshoppers that come in and eat all the plants, and they're often associated with plagues. So God's going to send the locusts, but Amos, as a prophet, intercedes for Israel, and Yahweh changes his mind. He's not going to send the locusts. Second plague, or second vision, is fire. God's going to destroy Israel with fire, but Amos intercedes on behalf of Israel. Yahweh reverses his plan. Then we get a plumb line. It's a weight tied to the end of a string that carpenters and builders use to get straight up and down lines in their buildings. This time, Amos does not intercede on behalf of Israel. Then we get a basket of ripe fruit, which signifies that the end has come. This is wordplay. The way you say ripe fruit in Hebrew is kayitz, which means the end. And end in Hebrew is kates. So kayitz, kates. And the earth shakes. Remember that in the superscription talk of the earthquake. All right, so earth shakes and there'll be death. And right in the middle of these visions, between vision 3 and 4, we get one of the most famous stories in Amos, where he has a confrontation with a priest who worked at the religious city of Bethel at the temple. So let's read these passages. All right, the man's name is Amaziah. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to Jeroboam, king of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, and eat bread there, and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor the son of a prophet, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And Yahweh took me from following the flock, and Yahweh said to me, Go prophesy to the people of Israel. Now, therefore, hear the word of Yahweh. You say, Do not prophesy against Israel, and do not preach against the house of Isaac. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, Your wife shall be a harlot in the city, and your sons and your daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be parceled out by the line. You yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel shall surely go away into exile away from its land. All right, a couple points. Notice that Amos denies being a prophet. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. That seems to show that there's a negative stigma attached with the institution of prophecy. We'll see that theme quite a bit. Also, it seems like Amos is not a person you'd want to mess with. It's like he's saying, You're telling me to shut up? Listen, your wife's going to be a prostitute. What do you think about that? Your kid's going to get slaughtered. This is seemingly in reference to what's going to happen to Israel after the reign of Jeroboam II. Incidentally, from passages such as 2 Kings 14:29, it seems Jeroboam died peacefully and did not die by the sword, as Amos predicted. This is what scholars refer to as the criteria of embarrassment, meaning we can be pretty sure a prophet in the Bible actually said something when that prediction does not come true. At other times, later editors might have come in to harmonize the text and change it to make it so the prophet was correct. But back to Amaziah and Israel. After Jeroboam's death, there's a rapid decline as the Assyrian Empire grows more and more powerful. First, under Tiglath-Pileser III, several towns fall to the Assyrians and people are exiled around 734 BCE. Then the nation of Israel comes to an end in 722 BCE when the capital city, Samaria, falls to the army led by Tiglath-Pileser's son and successor, Shalmaneser V. So that is Amos. Amos's prophetic career marks a turning point in the ancient world. First, with the date of his prophecy around 750 BCE, he's the earliest prophet to have a book named after him. A book in the Bible named after him, that is. We're evolving from a prophet like Elijah, who runs around like a shaman performing miracles, to a prophet now who addresses large groups of people with an emphasis on the written word. Second, we are seeing an evolution of the understanding of Yahweh. Previously, Yahweh was seen as the deity of Israel, much like Baal was the primary deity for Phoenicians, Chemosh for the Moabites, or later Zeus for the Greeks, Hadad for Damascus. Now with Amos, there's a notion that Yahweh is the deity of all nations and all people. So that's it for Amos. If you're interested, I'd recommend watching the video on Hosea next. Like Amos, he was an 8th century prophet who worked in Israel. The end.